Sometimes, change arrives in the most unexpected of places, like a small town where time seems to stand still, where cobblestone streets wind around silent houses, and where every face knows the other by name. Willow Creek was that place, a town nestled in the arms of rolling hills, bathed in soft golden light, yet shrouded by the weight of routine and old traditions. Here, ambition was a foreign word, and dreams were often buried beneath whispered gossip and familiar comforts. It wasn't the kind of place where people arrived looking for hope, but Claire Bennett did, a failed artist from the city, carrying a worn sketchbook and a heart heavy with disappointment. Claire stumbled into Willow Creek, desperate for a fresh start. Ryan Carter, the quiet chef behind the diner his mother once ran, never imagined life beyond his kitchen. The same meals, the same faces, the same predictable rhythm of his days. That's where Ryan found safety. Or so he thought. When their worlds collided, it was like the first crack in an old stone wall. A meeting that seemed small and fleeting, but held the potential to ignite something far greater. Neither Claire nor Ryan knew that their fears, their struggles, and their dreams would weave together into a story that would change not only their lives, but the very soul of Willow Creek. Can an artist without confidence and a chef without vision inspire each other to break free? And in a town reluctant to embrace change, can two lost souls create something that inspires others to dream again? The morning light in Willow Creek fell softly on the cobblestone streets, as if afraid to disturb the sleepy rhythm of the town. The clock tower, standing tall at the center of the square, remained frozen at 10:27, a quiet symbol of how time had been forgotten here. Willow Creek's charm wasn't lost on visitors, but it was clear this was a town reluctant to move forward. Its traditions were as rooted as the century-old oak trees lining its edges. Claire Bennett stepped off the rust-red bus, the sharp hiss of its brakes breaking the fragile silence. She clutched her bag tightly, her fingers tracing the edges of her sketchbook inside. Dressed in jeans and a paint-splattered jacket, her dark hair pulled into a loose bun, Claire looked every bit the wandering artist she had become. But her eyes, wide and weary, betrayed the storm inside her. As she stood by the edge of the square, she inhaled deeply, taking in the crisp autumn air, laced with the faint aroma of baked bread and wood smoke. "Maybe this is it," she whispered to herself, "the place where I start over." Across the square, Ryan Carter stood behind the counter of Carter's Diner. The smell of frying bacon filled the cozy space as the morning regulars settled into their usual booths. Ryan's movements were precise, cracking eggs, flipping pancakes, slicing bread, all performed with the practiced ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. He wore a plain white apron over a worn blue shirt, his sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms scarred from years of kitchen work. The diner was his world. It was his mother's legacy, a gift she left him when she passed. And while the world outside had changed, Carter's Diner had remained untouched, serving the same menu of hearty breakfasts and no-frills lunches that the townsfolk adored. Ryan paused, wiping his hands on a towel as he glanced through the window. That's when he saw her. Claire sat on a wooden bench beneath the clock tower, her sketchbook balanced on her knees. Her pencil moved across the page with an intensity that caught Ryan's attention. There was something about her, the way she leaned into her work, completely unaware of the world around her. The wind tugged at a strand of her hair, but she didn't seem to notice. She was different, a stranger. "Ryan, can we get a refill here?" Old Mr. Jenkins' voice cut through his thoughts. Ryan blinked, tearing his gaze away from the window. "Sure thing, Mr. Jenkins," he said with a faint smile, grabbing the coffee pot. But even as he went about his tasks, He found his thoughts drifting back to the woman outside. Who is she, and what's she doing here? By the time Claire closed her sketchbook, the sun was high overhead, warming the chilly air. Her stomach growled, a reminder that she hadn't eaten since leaving Seattle the night before. She scanned the square and spotted the diner. Its large window displayed a faded sign reading Carter's Diner, home-cooked meals, since 1964. The wooden door swung open as a man stepped out, holding a small boy's hand. Claire hesitated for a moment, then slung her bag over her shoulder and headed inside. The bell above the door jingled softly as Claire entered. The warm smell of coffee, buttered toast, and sizzling meat enveloped her like a welcome embrace. The diner's decor was simple: checkered tablecloths, mismatched chairs, and walls lined with framed photos of Willow Creek through the decades. Claire could almost feel its history seeping into her. Ryan looked up from behind the counter, his dark eyes briefly locking with hers. For a moment, the sounds of the diner, forks scraping plates, conversations buzzing, seemed to fade into the background. "Take a seat anywhere," he said, his voice calm but curious. He watched as Claire settled into a corner booth by the window, her bag carefully placed beside her. Ryan approached, a coffee pot in hand. "Coffee?" Claire nodded. "Hey, yes, please. Black." As he poured, he glanced at the sketchbook peeking out of her bag. "You're an artist?" Claire's lips quirked into a faint smile. "I sketch. I wouldn't call myself an artist." Ryan raised an eyebrow but didn't push further. "Well, welcome to Carter's Diner. I'm Ryan." "Claire." She looked up at him, her gaze steady. "Nice to meet you." The silence stretched for a moment, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Claire turned her attention to the menu. "What do you recommend?" "Depends. You looking for something familiar or something different?" Claire's smile widened just slightly. "Surprise me." Ryan returned to the kitchen, his mind still turning over the image of Claire sketching outside. He didn't know why, but something about her, about the quiet focus she carried, stirred a long dormant part of him. Without thinking, he reached for the ingredients for his mother's lemon cake. When Ryan returned with a steaming cup of tea and a slice of lemon cake, Claire raised an eyebrow. "Didn't expect dessert for lunch." "It's not just dessert," Ryan said, setting the plate down. "It's a family recipe." Claire picked up her fork and took a bite. The burst of citrus mingled with soft sweetness, surprising her taste buds. "Wow," she murmured, looking up at him. "This is really good." Ryan smiled faintly, his chest swelling with unexpected pride. "Glad you like it." Claire nodded, setting her fork down. "It's more than good. It's different." For Ryan, the word lingered in the air. Different. He'd heard it before, but not like this. Not as a compliment. He glanced at her sketchbook again and couldn't help but ask, "Mind if I see what you're working on?" Claire hesitated, then slid the book across the table. Ryan flipped it open, his brow furrowing, as he studied her sketch of the clock tower. Each line, each shadow, was captured with startling precision, yet it pulsed with something more, a quiet energy he couldn't explain. "It's beautiful," he said softly. Claire's cheeks flushed slightly. "Thanks. I wasn't sure anyone would see it that way." Ryan met her gaze. "Well, they should." At that moment, something passed between them. A quiet understanding born of unspoken struggles. Two people, both lost in their own ways, had crossed paths. And though neither of them knew it yet, this was only the beginning. The days in Willow Creek passed with an unhurried rhythm. The town square bustled only at specific hours, mornings when the bakery released the scent of freshly baked bread into the crisp air, and afternoons when the market hummed with quiet chatter. But once the sun began to dip behind the surrounding hills, the streets emptied, and the town fell silent as though held in a nostalgic slumber. For Claire Bennett, the stillness was both comforting and suffocating. Her rented cottage sat at the edge of town, a small space filled with mismatched furniture and soft golden light. Every evening, the low hum of the heater accompanied her as she spread her sketchbook across the wooden dining table. Pencils and charcoal sprawled like relics of her ambition. Yet more often than not, Claire found herself staring at the blank pages, her hand frozen, her mind a storm of old words and past failures. The gallery had been everything Claire once dreamed of. Floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting the pulse of the city. Patrons sipping expensive wine as they critiqued art with affected confidence. Claire had stood nervously beside her paintings, her fingers nervously tapping against the hem of her dress. A man in a dark suit, the gallery curator, approached her work. A striking, moody landscape, rendered in charcoal and muted grays. He tilted his head, examining it as if deciphering a foreign language. "It's interesting," he said finally, his voice dry. "But I don't think it will resonate with our audience. Too niche, not commercial enough." Claire's heart sank, but she smiled weakly. "I wanted to express something raw, something different." "Different doesn't sell," the curator replied curtly, moving on to the next artist. Claire had stood there, her painting staring back at her, the echoes of his words pounding in her mind like a drumbeat. Different doesn't sell. That night, Claire packed up her paintings, stacked them in the back seat of her car, and left Seattle behind, swearing she would never put herself through that kind of rejection again. Now, sitting at her table in Willow Creek, those memories resurfaced like shadows crawling across her walls. She ran her fingertips over the blank page before her. It was ridiculous how one sentence from a stranger could wield so much power. Every time she picked up her pencil, she felt the weight of those words pulling her down, telling her to stop, to give up. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, and Claire closed the sketchbook in frustration. "Maybe they were right," she whispered to herself. "Maybe I don't belong anywhere." The smell of coffee brewing and bacon sizzling filled Carter's diner as Ryan worked behind the counter, his movements methodical. The diner, once his mother's pride, had become the heartbeat of Willow Creek. Every morning, familiar faces arrived at their usual booths, exchanging pleasantries and ordering the same meals they'd eaten for years. Today was no different. Ryan moved from table to table, greeting his regulars with quiet nods and polite smiles. But despite the routine comfort, he couldn't stop his mind from drifting. The memory of Claire sitting under the clock tower, lost in her sketchbook, lingered in his thoughts. There was something about her, an intensity, a quiet resolve, that both intrigued him and unsettled him. He had watched her face transform as she sketched, each line she drew, revealing a glimpse of the world she saw. It was the same look he once had when he experimented in his mother's kitchen as a boy, excited to create something new. But that excitement had been buried long ago under the expectations of Willow Creek. "Morning, Ryan," came a voice from the counter. It was Joe Simmons, one of the older regulars. "Coffee's a little strong today." Ryan poured another cup, without looking up. "I'll lighten it for you next time, Joe." Joe grunted, settling into his seat. His gaze shifted toward the window. "You seen that new girl around town? The one with the sketchbook?" Ryan's back stiffened slightly as he filled another order. "Yeah. Her name's Claire." Joe shook his head. "She won't last long. Outsiders never do." Ryan bit back his response, forcing himself to stay neutral. It wasn't the first time he'd heard that sentiment. Willow Creek was a place of tradition, where change was viewed as a threat. To many, Claire was an unwelcome ripple in their still pond. "You think she's trouble?" Clara, another regular, chimed in, stirring sugar into her coffee. "I saw her sitting out there yesterday, staring at the clock tower like she's planning something." "Maybe she's just drawing," Ryan said, his voice calm but firm. Clara sniffed. "She's not one of us, Ryan. You'd do well to keep your distance." Ryan said nothing, but the words burrowed under his skin like a splinter. He didn't understand why people were so quick to judge her, but he also couldn't ignore how their opinions made him feel uneasy. In Willow Creek, fitting in mattered more than anything, and Ryan had spent years walking that line, blending in with the town's expectations. That afternoon, Claire wandered through the Willow Creek market, her sketchbook clutched under her arm. Stalls of fresh produce lined the square, vendors calling out to passers-by in friendly tones. The air smelled of apples, cinnamon, and warm bread, but Claire felt none of the comfort it should have brought. She stopped near an old man stacking crates of apples, her eyes catching the way the sunlight turned the fruit into glowing orbs of red and gold. Without thinking, she pulled out her sketchbook and began drawing, quick, fluid strokes that captured the light, the texture, the quiet beauty of something ordinary. "Look at her, sketching again," someone murmured nearby. Claire's pencil paused mid-stroke, her heart sinking. She glanced up to see two women at a nearby stall whispering, their eyes flicking toward her. "What's she even doing here?" one asked. "She's probably from the city. Thinks she's better than us." Claire's stomach tightened, the same familiar ache returning. She shut the sketchbook abruptly and turned to leave, their whispers following her like a ghost. That evening, Claire returned to her cottage and sat at the window, staring out at the darkening sky. The loneliness she had felt in Seattle returned, sharper than before. She had come to Willow Creek, hoping to escape judgment, but now she realized that rejection could take many forms. It wasn't just gallery curators who could make you feel like you didn't belong. It was anyone who refused to see you for who you were. She picked up her pencil again, but her hand trembled. Outside, the faint chime of the clock tower echoed through the night. Meanwhile, at Carter's Diner, Ryan stood alone in the kitchen, scrubbing pots long after the last customer had left. He thought of Claire again, of the way she sketched the clock tower and the market scene, how she saw things the rest of them overlooked. He glanced at the faded menu pinned to the wall. It hadn't changed in years. Burgers, fried chicken, apple pie. Safe. Familiar. Ryan set the scrub brush down, staring at his reflection in the kitchen window. What if I tried something new? The thought lingered, and for the first time in a long time, Ryan felt a spark of something unfamiliar. Curiosity. The morning sunlight bathed Willow Creek in a pale golden hue, stretching across the cobblestone streets and casting soft shadows over storefronts. It was one of those rare mornings when the town seemed to hold its breath, the air heavy with the quiet promise of a day yet to unfold. Ryan Carter stood at the kitchen counter in Carter's Diner, absent-mindedly slicing lemons. The rhythmic motion of his knife was precise, but his thoughts were scattered. A quiet restlessness had begun to stir within him ever since Claire Bennett walked into town. It wasn't just her presence. It was the way she looked at the world, how her pencil captured beauty where no one else saw it. The clock tower, the market, even something as ordinary as a crate of apples. Claire made it seem extraordinary. Ryan had never thought of Willow Creek that way. As he placed the thin lemon slices into a mixing bowl of sugar to start the base for a lemon cake, his eyes drifted to the small window above the sink. Outside, the sun glimmered over the willow trees, lining the riverbank, their branches swaying gently with the wind. And there she was. Claire sat near the river, hunched over her sketchbook, her hand moving deftly across the page. Ryan's gaze lingered on her, caught by the stillness she carried. He wiped his hands on his apron, hesitating for a moment, before grabbing a small basket and placing the beginnings of the lemon cake, a few fresh slices sugar-coated and fragrant, inside. "Here goes nothing," he muttered, slipping out the back door. Claire didn't hear Ryan approach. The only sound she registered was the soft rustling of leaves overhead and the occasional ripple of water as it meandered over smooth stones. Her pencil moved with purpose this time, her lines confident as she captured the reflection of the willow trees in the river's surface. "You know, I never understood how people can draw moving water." Ryan's voice broke through the quiet. Startled, Claire looked up, shielding her eyes against the sunlight. Ryan stood there, holding a small basket in his hands. He looked both uncertain and determined, as though he was trying something completely out of his element. "It's not so much the water," Claire replied, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "It's the light. You have to draw. The way the light dances on the ripples." Ryan tilted his head, his brow furrowing slightly. "I guess I never thought about it like that." Claire smiled faintly. "Most people don't." Ryan set the basket down beside her on the grass, sitting down a few feet away. "Lemon cake," he explained, gesturing to the slices, "or at least the start of it. I thought you might need something sweet." Claire blinked in surprise, glancing at the carefully arranged slices in the basket. The sugar had melted slightly, pooling in tiny glistening beads that coated the edges. "You made this?" Ryan shrugged, looking away. "I guess I don't know much about art, but I know how to bake." Claire picked up a slice hesitantly and took a small bite. The sweetness of the sugar blended perfectly with the tartness of the lemon, creating a simple but vibrant flavor. For a moment, she said nothing, savoring the taste before finally looking up at him. "This is really good," she said softly. Ryan gave a lopsided smile. "Thanks." They sat in silence for a while after that, the kind of silence that didn't feel heavy or awkward, but instead offered a quiet understanding. Claire ran her fingers along the edge of her sketchbook, the worn leather cover, soft and familiar. Ryan watched her, sensing the way her thoughts seemed to pull her somewhere far away. "Can I ask you something?" Ryan finally said. Claire glanced at him, her expression cautious. "Sure." "Why did you leave the city?" Her smile faltered, and for a moment she looked as though she might close her sketchbook and retreat. But instead, she exhaled deeply and let the truth settle between them. "I failed," she admitted, her voice steady but small. "Or at least, that's what they told me. My work wasn't commercial enough. I couldn't sell my paintings or find a gallery willing to take me seriously. It felt like I was shouting into an empty room, and no one was listening." Ryan studied her carefully, his hands resting on his knees. "That's rough." Claire laughed bitterly. "You get used to it after a while. People love to tell you what you can't do." Ryan looked toward the river, the sunlight now sparkling like scattered diamonds across the water. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know that feeling." Claire tilted her head, curiosity flickering across her features. "You do." Ryan leaned back on his hands, staring up at the sky. "I took over my mom's diner. After she passed, it wasn't supposed to be my life's work, you know? I used to dream of opening a real restaurant, something small but special. A place where I could cook dishes that meant something, where food was more than just good. But Willow Creek isn't the kind of place for big ideas. People here want what they know." Claire frowned. "So you're stuck." More like scared, Ryan admitted. Scared to let them down. Scared that if I try something different, it'll fail. Claire nodded slowly, her expression softening. That's the thing about dreams. They're terrifying. For a long moment, they sat in silence again, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Ryan looked over at her. You ever think about submitting your work somewhere else? Just to see what happens? Claire shook her head. I'm not sure I can handle another rejection. Ryan picked up a blade of grass, twisting it between his fingers. Well, maybe you don't do it for them. Maybe you do it for yourself. Claire turned to look at him, surprised by the sincerity in his voice. And maybe you shouldn't give up, Ryan continued. I mean, what's the worst that could happen? You're already here. Claire gave him a look, half amusement and half challenge. What about you then? Why don't you try cooking something new? Something you want to make? Ryan smirked faintly. Touché. Seriously? Claire said, leaning forward slightly. What's stopping you? Ryan didn't answer right away. He just looked at the river, its surface shimmering under the sun, and then back at her. Finally, he said, maybe nothing. Claire smiled. Then maybe nothing's stopping me either. Ryan's grin widened, and for the first time in a long time, he felt that dormant spark of excitement return, like the whisper of something greater, just waiting to be found. Ryan returned to the diner that evening with a restless energy that surprised him. The place was quiet, save for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the wooden floors. He stood in the middle of the kitchen, staring at the ingredients in front of him. Fresh herbs, vegetables, spices, things he usually reserved for familiar dishes. But tonight, he picked up a recipe book he hadn't opened in years, its pages dog-eared and stained. Let's try something new, he murmured to himself. Outside, under the faint glow of the town's streetlights, Claire sat at her window with a cup of tea. Her sketchbook lay open, and for the first time in weeks, she picked up her pencil without hesitation. Her hand moved steadily, confidently, as she began to sketch. A simple image, a basket of lemons, glistening with sugar, resting on the grass beside a riverbank. And for a moment, both Claire and Ryan felt something shift, a quiet understanding that maybe, just maybe, they weren't as alone as they thought. The afternoon light in Willow Creek softened the sharp edges of the town, painting everything in hues of amber and gold. The clock tower loomed in the background as it always did, a symbol of constancy in a place where change was as unwelcome as a winter chill. The streets were quiet as Ryan Carter wiped down the counter in Carter's diner. The faint murmur of customers lingered as they finished their meals, most of them content to stick to their usual orders: burgers, fries, and apple pie. But that day, something felt different. Ryan had spent the entire night before experimenting. As the town slept, he had been in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, brow furrowed, trying to capture something new. The idea had started as a fleeting spark during his conversation with Claire by the river. Her words about light and movement had stuck with him. Why shouldn't food tell a story? Why couldn't flavor move like art? Now, as he looked down at the handwritten menu he had tucked into his apron, doubt gnawed at the edges of his confidence. Ryan stepped into the kitchen, a tray of freshly prepared dishes balanced carefully in his hands. At first glance, they looked familiar enough: a plate of roasted vegetables, a tart, a small bowl of soup. But if you looked closer, there were subtle changes, unusual spices, intricate plating, unexpected flavors layered into the simplest of meals. Mrs. Duncan, one of the diner's oldest regulars, peered at the tray suspiciously. "What's this, Ryan?" she asked, adjusting her thick glasses as he placed the dish in front of her. Ryan offered a small, nervous smile. Just something new I wanted to try. It's roasted carrots with a honey and cumin glaze. Thought you might like it. Mrs. Duncan poked at the carrots with her fork, her expression unreadable. Across the diner, a few other patrons glanced at the dish, curiosity flickering in their eyes, but quickly tempered by skepticism. "Looks fancy," muttered Tom Parsons, a farmer who always ordered the same thing, bacon and eggs. He shook his head and leaned back in his chair. "This ain't one of those city places, Ryan." Ryan bit back a retort, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the counter. "It's still the same diner, Tom. Just trying something different." Tom scoffed. "Different doesn't mean better." From the corner table, Claire watched silently. She'd come in that afternoon with her sketchbook in hand, hoping for a quiet moment to draw. But now she could see the tension in Ryan's shoulders as he carried himself between tables, trying to keep his chin up. Her gaze flickered to Mrs. Duncan, who took a hesitant bite of the roasted carrots. The older woman paused for a moment, her brow furrowed. But then she took another bite, softer this time. Ryan caught the moment out of the corner of his eye and felt the slightest flicker of hope. But before he could savor it, he heard the unmistakable sound of whispering. "Did you see what he brought out today?" Clara's voice carried from a booth near the back. She was hunched over a cup of coffee, her sharp gaze fixed on Ryan. "Glazed carrots? I mean, really. It's a diner, not some snooty cafe." "It's Claire," someone else chimed in, quieter but no less venomous. "Ever since she showed up, he's been acting different. She's a bad influence." Claire stiffened. The words, though spoken softly, felt like tiny knives piercing her armor. She lowered her head and tried to focus on the sketch in front of her, but her hand trembled slightly, smudging the lines she'd carefully drawn. Ryan heard them too. He didn't confront Clara. He never did. Instead, he wiped his hands on his apron and busied himself in the kitchen, his mind racing. He knew the town wouldn't understand right away, but hearing their judgment out loud stung more than he expected. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Ryan found Claire sitting on the diner's back steps, her sketchbook open in her lap. The golden light caught in her hair, turning it into soft strands of fire. She didn't look up as he approached, but he noticed the way her shoulders were slumped. "You okay?" he asked softly, leaning against the doorframe. Claire paused before answering, her voice quiet. "They're not wrong, you know. I am a bad influence." Ryan frowned, stepping closer. "Don't say that." She looked up at him then, her dark eyes searching his face. "Ever since I got here, you've been trying things, experimenting, and now they're turning on you. It's my fault." Ryan crouched down beside her, meeting her gaze head-on. "Listen, Claire. They're not mad because of you. They're mad because I'm trying to change something they don't want to see change." "And what if they're right?" she whispered. "What if we're just wasting our time?" Ryan was silent for a moment, before reaching into his apron pocket. He pulled out a folded napkin and handed it to her. "Open it." Claire frowned but took the napkin carefully, unfolding it to reveal a tiny, delicate sketch of a lemon cake. Her lines precise, the shading giving it texture and life. Her breath caught in her throat. "I drew it," Ryan admitted sheepishly. "Or, well, I tried. I'm not an artist, but I wanted to see what it felt like to make something the way you do." Claire stared at the drawing, her chest tightening. "Why?" "Because I wanted you to know how it feels to see what you create," Ryan said softly. "You showed me that food can tell a story, that I can do more than just make burgers and fries. You make me want to be better, Claire. And if that's being a bad influence, then so be it." Her eyes shimmered as she looked back at him, overwhelmed by the quiet sincerity in his words. "You should keep drawing," Ryan added. "And I'll keep cooking. They'll come around eventually." Claire smiled faintly, holding the napkin to her chest. "You're more of an artist than you think, Ryan." He grinned. "Don't tell anyone. I have a reputation to uphold." The days that followed were marked by subtle but significant changes. Claire sketched a new drawing, a simple image of the diner bathed in evening light, and gave it to Ryan, who framed it and hung it near the counter. He didn't say anything about it, but when Mrs. Duncan commented on how nice it looked, Ryan couldn't stop himself from smiling. At night, Ryan continued experimenting, dishes inspired by Claire's sketches. Sunsets, rivers, trees began to take shape. He blended familiar flavors with unexpected twists, quietly perfecting his craft. Claire, in turn, found herself sketching with more freedom. She wandered through Willow Creek, finding inspiration in its quiet corners. A cluster of wildflowers near the river, a rusted weather vane, the clock tower at dusk. Neither of them spoke much about the town's whispers. They simply worked, letting their creations speak for them. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Ryan placed a new dish in front of Tom Parsons. Roasted chicken with rosemary and orange glaze. Tom grumbled at first, but eventually took a bite, chewing thoughtfully. Ryan waited, arms crossed, watching him carefully. Finally, Tom set his fork down and grunted. "It's good." Ryan's heart leapt. "Yeah?" Tom nodded, his face betraying just the slightest hint of approval. "Don't get carried away, though. It's still a diner." Ryan chuckled, shaking his head. "Wouldn't dream of it." In the back corner, Claire smiled to herself as she watched the exchange. The whispers were still there, but so was something new. A whisper of change, quiet but undeniable. The days in Willow Creek grew shorter, the early chill of autumn creeping into the air. Leaves on the trees by the river had turned brilliant shades of crimson and gold, drifting lazily to the ground. Despite the scenic beauty, a palpable tension settled over the small town, like a storm on the horizon, just waiting to break. For Ryan Carter, the diner was both sanctuary and battlefield. He stood behind the counter one morning, staring at a nearly empty room. The regulars, once loyal, were dwindling. Clara hadn't shown up for her usual coffee and gossip, and Tom Parsons had skipped breakfast for 2 days in a row. Ryan glanced at the framed sketch Claire had drawn of the diner, now hung proudly near the window. For him, it symbolized hope, a reminder that he was building something new, even if the world around him refused to see it. But lately that hope felt like it was slipping through his fingers. The bell above the diner door jingled, and Ryan looked up expectantly. It wasn't a customer, but Claire. "Morning," she said softly, setting her sketchbook on the counter. She glanced around the room, noticing the emptiness before turning back to Ryan. "Quiet today." Ryan forced a smile. "I guess burgers and coffee weren't different enough." Claire sat on one of the bar stools, her expression clouded with concern. "Ryan, maybe you should stop. Go back to how things were." Ryan paused mid-motion, a coffee cup in his hand. "You think I should give up?" "I didn't say that," Claire replied quickly. "But—" Ryan slammed the cup down harder than he intended, coffee sloshing over the rim. "But what? You think they're right? Oh, that I'm wasting my time?" Claire recoiled slightly, surprised by the sharpness in his tone. "That's not what I meant." Ryan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Sorry. I just—" His voice trailed off as he looked out the window. The familiar ache of frustration settled in his chest, the same frustration that had haunted him since taking over the diner. The whispers, the judgment, the feeling of being trapped. Claire reached out, touching his hand gently. "I just don't want you to get hurt." that's all. Her words, though kind, only deepened his unease. Later that day, Claire sat by the window of her small rental cottage, staring at the rejection email glowing on her laptop screen. Thank you for your submission. Unfortunately, your work does not align with our current vision. We encourage you to keep creating and wish you success in the future. The words burned into her brain, cold and clinical. She leaned back in her chair, her body folding in on itself, as though she could disappear into the shadows. It wasn't the first rejection, but something about this one stung deeper, perhaps because she had allowed herself to hope. She closed the laptop sharply and turned to look at the walls of her living room. They were covered with sketches, drawings, unfinished canvases, all pieces of herself she had poured onto paper. But in that moment, they felt like failures, reminders of dreams that she had chased relentlessly, only to be told again and again that she wasn't good enough. Claire grabbed a half-finished sketch of the clock tower from the table and stared at it, her chest tightening. Without thinking, she crumpled it into a ball and threw it across the room. "What's the point?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Tears began to well in her eyes, blurring her vision. She sank onto the floor, knees pulled to her chest, and sobbed, silent, aching cries that she had been holding back for far too long. The next few days passed in a haze. Ryan noticed immediately when Claire stopped coming to the diner. The empty corner table where she often sat, sketching and quietly sipping tea, seemed to mock him, a silent testament to her absence. At first, he assumed she was busy or needed time to herself. But as the days stretched on, worry gnawed at him. He remembered the sadness he'd glimpsed in her eyes, the way her voice had trembled when she mentioned rejection. And he knew, something wasn't right. On a cool, windy evening, Ryan grabbed a basket from the kitchen. He packed it with food, lemon cake, a thermos of tea, and a few fresh rolls. Slinging his coat over his shoulders, he set out toward Claire's cottage, the basket swinging at his side. The walk through Willow Creek was quiet, save for the whisper of wind through the trees. The lights in Claire's cottage were dim when he arrived, and for a moment, Ryan hesitated. He didn't want to intrude, but something told him she needed someone. Taking a deep breath, he knocked gently on the door. There was no response. "Claire," Ryan called softly. After a long pause, the door creaked open slightly. Claire stood there, her face pale, and her eyes red-rimmed, as though she hadn't slept in days. Ryan's heart clenched. "Claire, what's going on?" "I don't want to talk about it," she muttered, starting to close the door. But Ryan stuck his foot out, preventing it from shutting completely. "Please," he said quietly, "let me in." Claire hesitated before stepping aside, allowing him to enter. The cottage was dim, the air heavy and still. Sketches were scattered across the floor, some crumpled and torn. Ryan set the basket on the table and looked at her carefully. "Claire," he began gently. "What happened?" She shook her head, her voice trembling. "I got another rejection. It doesn't matter. They were right. Maybe I'm not good enough." Ryan frowned, his chest tightening at her words. "That's not true." Claire's eyes flashed with anger, the frustration she had been bottling up, finally breaking free. "How would you know, Ryan? You don't understand what it's like to keep failing, to put everything you have into something, only to have it thrown back in your face." Ryan stayed silent for a moment, letting her words hang in the air. Finally he spoke, his voice low but steady. "You think I don't understand? Claire, I've spent my entire life trying to live up to this town's expectations, trying to run my mom's diner the way she did, because I was too scared to do anything different. I know what it feels like to fail." Claire's anger softened, replaced by exhaustion. She sank onto the edge of the couch, her shoulders slumped. "Then why keep trying?" she whispered. Ryan sat beside her, pulling the thermos of tea from the basket and pouring her a cup. He handed it to her, his voice calm. "Because failure isn't the end. It's just part of the story." Claire looked up at him, her gaze searching his face. "What if I don't have it in me to keep going?" Ryan smiled faintly. "Then, let me remind you." He gestured toward her sketches scattered across the room. "Look at these, Claire. Look at what you've created. You might not see it, but your art is yours. No one can take that from you." Claire stared at him, tears pooling in her eyes again, this time not from despair, but from the quiet truth in his words. "What if I fail again?" Ryan reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Then you get back up, and I'll be here, cheering you on." For the first time in days, Claire smiled faintly. They sat together in the small cottage, the sound of the wind outside a quiet reminder of the world beyond. Ryan stayed until Claire had finished her tea and the color had returned to her cheeks. As he left, he paused at the door, glancing back at her. "Promise me you won't stop," he said softly. Claire nodded, gripping her sketchbook tightly. "I won't." And as Ryan disappeared into the night, Claire sat at her table, flipping to a fresh page in her sketchbook. She picked up her pencil with trembling hands and slowly, hesitantly, began to draw. The storm inside her wasn't gone, but for the first time in a long time, there was a break in the clouds. The next morning, the sky over Willow Creek was streaked with hues of orange and pink, as though painted by an unseen hand. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and dew, a quiet contrast to the lingering tension in both Ryan and Claire's lives. For the first time in days, Claire sat on the steps of her cottage, staring at her sketchbook with determination. The page was blank, but it no longer terrified her. Ryan's words had planted a seed, small but unyielding. Failure isn't the end. With the soft scratch of her pencil against the page, she began to draw. At the Green Plate Diner, Ryan was already hard at work. The clang of pans, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables, and the hiss of a hot skillet filled the quiet kitchen. He had barely slept after leaving Claire's cottage the night before, but his mind was alive with ideas. Spread across the counter were Claire's sketches that he had saved. A drawing of the clock tower bathed in sunset, a snapshot of the river's reflection, and a fleeting sketch of the diner's cozy interior. Each drawing told a story of Willow Creek, not the way the town saw itself, but the way Claire saw it. Alive, beautiful, brimming with potential. Inspired by her art, Ryan began to create. He worked with an energy he hadn't felt in years, his movements confident and precise. He chopped heirloom tomatoes and roasted peppers, letting their sweetness mingle in a balsamic reduction. He shaped dough for fresh-baked bread, seasoning it with herbs he had never dared to use in the diner before: rosemary, thyme, and cracked sea salt. And finally, he blended vibrant carrot and ginger soup, its bright orange hue mirroring Claire's sunset sketch. The dishes were bold and unusual, but they were his. By the time the clock struck noon, the diner was filled with the aroma of something new. Ryan stood back, arms crossed, surveying his work. For once, he wasn't afraid of what people would say. Meanwhile, Claire wandered through the town, her sketchbook in hand. She paused at familiar sights: the market square, the general store, the cobblestone streets where children played hopscotch. Instead of seeing these places as stale and stagnant, she began to see the stories within them: moments of joy, subtle beauty, and life. At the market, she sketched the fruit stands brimming with apples and pumpkins, their rich colors layered against the wooden stalls. She caught the elderly grocer laughing with a child who had dropped a pear, the warmth of the scene easing something heavy in her chest. At the riverbank, she drew the reflection of the trees on the water, her pencil flowing easily over the page, as if her hand remembered something her heart had forgotten. Claire's sketches were no longer cautious and hesitant. They were alive, pulsing with movement and energy. She began to lose herself in the process, no longer thinking of gallery rejections or the judgment of others. That evening, Ryan unlocked the diner's front door, propping it open with a heavy brick. He placed Claire's sketches on small easels around the room, one by the window, another near the counter, and a third by the entrance. Their presence changed the diner, softening its edges and infusing it with new life. Ryan stood nervously behind the counter as the first customers arrived. Old Joe was the first through the door, his usual frown deepening as he spotted a sketch of the clock tower near the window. "What's all this?" Joe grumbled, pointing at the artwork. Ryan cleared his throat. "Just something new. And so is the menu tonight." Joe's gaze narrowed. "Menu? What's wrong with the regular stuff?" "Nothing's wrong with it," Ryan said, forcing a calm smile. "But I thought we could try something different." He handed Joe a steaming bowl of the carrot and ginger soup, garnished with a swirl of cream and fresh chives. Joe sniffed it skeptically, his thick eyebrows furrowing. "Carrot soup?" he muttered, stirring the spoon cautiously. "Looks fancy." Ryan watched, his pulse quickening as Joe took a spoonful. For a long moment, the older man said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then, to Ryan's surprise, Joe nodded slowly. "Not bad," he said gruffly, taking another bite. "Not bad at all." Other customers trickled in throughout the evening, their curiosity outweighing their hesitation. Ryan served his roasted vegetable tartines, fragrant with rosemary, and plates of golden bread fresh from the oven. Claire's artwork caught their eyes as they ate, each sketch drawing murmurs of appreciation. "This one's of the river," a teenage girl said, tugging on her mother's sleeve. "Isn't it pretty?" "Who drew these?" someone asked Ryan. "Claire Bennett," he replied proudly. "She's an artist, lives here in Willow Creek." For the first time, Claire's name was spoken with admiration, not suspicion. Claire entered the diner late that evening, surprised by the warm buzz of conversation. She paused in the doorway, taking it all in. The sketches she had drawn on display, Ryan moving confidently between tables, the soft glow of the diner's lights against the gathering night. Ryan spotted her and approached with a wide grin. "You made it." Claire nodded, unable to hide her smile. "I didn't expect this." He gestured toward the sketches. "People love your work, Claire. I knew they would." Claire looked around, her heart swelling, as she watched people pause to admire her drawings. For the first time, she felt seen, not as an outsider, but as an artist. Ryan led her to a table near the window and set a plate in front of her. Roasted vegetables nestled atop a bed of herb-infused bread. Claire raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What's this?" "Your sunset sketch," Ryan said simply. "I made it into a dish." Claire blinked, startled by the thoughtfulness behind his words. She picked up her fork and took a bite. The flavors, sweet, smoky, and earthy, melted together perfectly, like pieces of a puzzle she hadn't realized were missing. "It's wonderful," she murmured. Ryan sat across from her, his gaze soft. "Your sketches, they gave me inspiration, Claire. You don't know how much you've done for me." Claire met his eyes, the weight of his words sinking in. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she had made a difference. As the evening drew to a close, the diner grew quiet once more. Ryan and Claire sat together at the counter, sipping tea and watching the glow of the streetlights outside. Claire flipped open her sketchbook, turning to a blank page. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I think I might submit something to that art competition after all." Ryan's face lit up with pride. "You should. They'd be lucky to see your work." Claire smiled, her pencil poised above the paper. "And you? What's next for you, Chef Carter?" Ryan chuckled, leaning back against the counter. "Keep cooking. Keep trying. Maybe one day people will line up around the block for carrot soup." Claire laughed softly, the sound filling the empty diner like music. She turned her attention back to the sketchbook, her hand moving steadily across the page. Outside, the lights of Willow Creek flickered gently, and for the first time in a long time, the town felt alive, its pulse quickening with the sparks of inspiration left by an artist and a chef who dared to dream. The Green Plate Diner had never seen days quite like these. Each morning, Ryan arrived earlier than ever, sleeves rolled up and determination etched across his face. The quiet hum of the kitchen was now filled with energy, his energy. Fresh herbs sat in small pots by the window, their vibrant green, a symbol of his renewed creativity. New recipes danced in his mind as he crafted dishes inspired by Claire's sketches, blending local familiarity with bold, untried flavors. Claire's artwork now graced the diner's walls permanently. Each piece reflected the quiet beauty of Willow Creek, from the market scenes to the riverbanks bathed in gold. But it was more than just art. It was a mirror. The town that had resisted change for so long now saw itself in a new light, small moments captured with care, life rendered in ways they hadn't stopped to appreciate before. And yet, not everyone was ready for the reflection. "What's happened to the diner?" Old Joe grumbled one afternoon, stabbing his spoon into his bowl of carrot and ginger soup. "Used to be simple. Now it's all fancy." Clara Jenkins, perched at her usual table, pursed her lips as she studied one of Claire's sketches. "I hear this artist, Claire. She came here because she couldn't make it in the city. And now, look what she's doing, stirring things up." The murmur of dissent rippled through the room like a slow-moving storm cloud. At first, it was just whispers, familiar voices muttering under their breath, shaking their heads at Ryan's menu or Claire's presence. But the whispers grew louder. Outside the diner, Ryan noticed the shift. Where once customers had stopped to greet him warmly, some now avoided eye contact. Others exchanged looks, their judgment lingering in the air like smoke. Claire felt it too. Walking through town, she caught the sidelong glances, the lowered voices, the silence that seemed to follow her wherever she went. The feeling was sharp and familiar, reminding her of gallery critics who spoke in hushed tones, dismissing her work before her eyes. One afternoon, she sat sketching near the old Willow Creek clock tower. Her pencil moved fluidly across the page, but her shoulders were tense, her mind replaying the snippets of gossip she'd overheard. "She's trouble. Thinks she's too good for this place. She'll leave soon enough. Just wait." The words sliced at her confidence, each one a small, cruel echo of her fears. Ryan found her there hours later, sitting on the stone steps beneath the clock, her sketchbook balanced on her lap. The drawing was unfinished, strokes trailing off into uncertainty. "Claire?" Ryan's voice was gentle. She looked up, startled. "Oh, hey." Ryan approached and sat beside her. "You've been quiet lately?" Claire let out a sigh, her gaze fixed on the clock's weathered face. "They don't want me here, Ryan. I feel it. Everywhere I go." Ryan frowned, frustration simmering beneath his calm exterior. "Not everyone feels that way." Claire turned to him, her expression conflicted. "Doesn't matter. The ones who do, they're loud enough. Days passed, and the tension in Willow Creek grew. The whispers in the diner turned into words, pointed comments thrown around with less care. Ryan's ruining his mother's legacy. That artist is dragging him down. Claire's presence was blamed for everything. Ryan's changes to the menu, the fancy dishes, the strange new energy in a town that prided itself on being unchanged. One evening, the conflict erupted. The diner was full, though the atmosphere was brittle. Clara Jenkins sat at her table, her disapproval plain, as she poked at a plate of roasted vegetable tartine. Across the room, Ryan moved between tables, a smile fixed on his face as he tried to hold the unraveling threads of the diner together. Clara's voice broke through the chatter. "Ryan, I don't know what's gotten into you, but this isn't what your mother built. This isn't the green plate." The room fell silent. Every eye turned toward Clara, then to Ryan. Ryan straightened, his smile faltering. "Clara, I'm just trying something new." "I knew?" Clara scoffed. "This town doesn't need new. We need familiar. We need the old green plate, not some—" Her gaze flicked to Claire's sketches. "Art gallery?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Ryan's jaw clenched as he set down the tray he'd been holding. "The diner's still the same, Clara. I'm just adding a little more of myself to it." "And what about her?" Clara's tone was sharp, accusatory. She turned toward Claire, who sat frozen at the corner table. "She's the one who started all this, sticking her nose where it doesn't belong." Claire's cheeks flushed, her fingers tightening around her pencil. She opened her mouth to respond, but Ryan's voice cut through the room. "That's enough." The diner went silent again. Ryan's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. "Claire hasn't done anything wrong. If anything, she's shown me what's possible." Clara shook her head, pushing her plate aside. "You'll lose everything, Ryan. Mark my words." Without another word, she stood and left, the door slamming behind her. A handful of customers followed, muttering under their breath. Ryan stood in the silence that remained, his hands at his sides. Claire watched him, her heart sinking, as she saw the conflict etched into his face. That night, after the last customer had gone, Ryan found Claire sitting alone at a corner table, her sketchbook closed in front of her. "Claire, I'm sorry," she said quickly, cutting him off. "This is my fault. I shouldn't have come here." Ryan frowned, walking toward her. "Don't say that. None of this is your fault." Claire looked up, frustration in her eyes. "Isn't it? Everything was fine until I showed up. I'm ruining things for you, Ryan." Ryan's temper flared. "You're not ruining anything. People just—" He paused, running a hand through his hair. "They don't like change. But that doesn't mean they're right." Claire shook her head, rising from the table. "Maybe they are. Maybe this was a mistake. I came here to escape, not to make things harder for someone else." Ryan stared at her, his voice dropping. "You think you're the only one who feels trapped. I've been stuck here my whole life, Claire. This diner, this town, it's all I know. And for once, I thought I could do something more, something better." Claire hesitated, her shoulders slumping. "And now, they blame me for it." Ryan softened, regret seeping into his voice. "Claire, don't let them get to you. You're stronger than that." Her gaze met his, her voice barely a whisper. "Maybe I'm not." Without another word, Claire turned and left the diner, the door closing softly behind her. Ryan stood alone, staring at the empty tables, the sketches on the walls, the plates of untouched food. The warmth of the diner felt distant now, replaced by a cold, suffocating weight. The next morning, The clock tower chimed faintly in the distance, its sound a ghostly echo through the town. Claire's cottage sat dark and silent, the curtains drawn. Her sketchbook lay untouched on the small wooden table by the window. At the green plate, Ryan worked quietly, his movements slower than usual. The diner was emptier than it had been in weeks. The vibrant sketches on the walls seemed out of place now, their brightness dulled by the unspoken tension hanging in the air. Outside, the people of Willow Creek went about their day. But something had changed. The line between progress and tradition had been drawn, and the town was no longer the same. In their separate corners of the world, Ryan and Claire both wondered the same thing. Was it worth it? The air in Willow Creek had shifted. Where once there was a quiet hum of life, neighbors chatting by their picket fences, the sound of bicycle wheels on cobblestone streets, now there was an uneasy silence, punctuated only by whispers. It was as though the town had drawn a collective breath, unsure whether to move forward or cling tightly to the past. Claire felt the weight of it every time she left her small cottage. The simple act of walking to the general store became a gauntlet of judgment. Heads turned away when she passed. Conversations fell silent the moment she entered a room. The artist, the outsider, they had labeled her as both. At the green plate, things weren't much better. Ryan's once bustling diner now sat eerily quiet during peak hours. Regulars, people Ryan had served for years, no longer filled the booths. Some came just to eat quickly and leave, their eyes refusing to meet his. Others avoided the place entirely, the sound of its bell at the door conspicuously absent. Ryan's attempts to keep spirits high were admirable, but increasingly forced. He plastered on a smile as he worked the kitchen, trying to ignore the gnawing doubt that now kept him awake at night. The tension reached a boiling point one Friday evening. Claire had stayed up late, sketching by the window of her dimly lit cottage. The familiar scratch of her pencil had always been a source of comfort, but tonight it was a hollow ritual. Her mind wandered back to the green plate, to Ryan, his defiance, his exhaustion. She wondered what kept him going. For her, everything felt futile. Then came the knock at the door. Claire's heart jumped. Willow Creek wasn't the kind of town where people dropped by unannounced, especially not at this hour. She hesitated before opening it. It was Ryan. The light from the street lamp outside cast long shadows on his face, his eyes dark and tired. "Claire." His voice was low, hesitant, almost vulnerable. "Ryan, is everything okay?" Claire stepped back to let him in, her brows furrowed in concern. Ryan ran a hand through his hair as he walked in, his movements heavy with frustration. "I can't take it anymore. This town, these people, I've given them everything. My mother gave them everything. And now they treat me like this place doesn't even belong to me." Claire's chest tightened. "It's not your fault, Ryan. They're scared of change. You're challenging the way they see the world." Ryan let out a bitter laugh, sinking into the old chair by her desk. "And what about you, Claire? They hate you for even trying to show them something beautiful. For what? Sketching a clock tower? Drawing a mural? Why does everything new have to be a threat?" Claire didn't respond immediately. She sat on the armrest of the sofa across from him, her hands clasped tightly together. Because new means letting go. And letting go is hard. The words hung between them, heavy and unspoken. Both of them knew she wasn't just talking about the town. Ryan rubbed his face with both hands, sighing deeply. "They're calling a town hall meeting tomorrow. You know what that means?" Claire felt her throat tighten. She did know. In a place like Willow Creek, a town hall wasn't just a meeting, it was a trial. The next evening, the Willow Creek Community Hall filled with people. The old building, its wooden benches worn smooth over decades, groaned under the weight of the gathered crowd. The mood was tense, a silent energy buzzing in the air. Claire sat near the back, her head down, fingers tracing the edges of her sketchbook. Ryan stood near the front, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, trying to appear calm, even as his heart hammered in his chest. Mayor Whitlock, an older man with silver hair and a voice like gravel, stood at the podium, calling the meeting to order. "We're here tonight to discuss concerns that have been raised regarding changes at the Green Plate Diner and their impact on our town." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Ryan clenched his fists. "Ah, Ryan Carter," the mayor continued, his voice steady. "You've run the Green Plate for years. Your mother built it with her hands, and we've always supported it because it was ours, a part of Willow Creek." Ryan swallowed hard, stepping forward. "It still is, Mayor. I'm not trying to change everything, just trying to add something more. Something I can be proud of." "Proud of?" Clara Jenkins stood abruptly, her voice sharp. "Your mother never needed quinoa salads or lemon tarts to make us proud. She made chicken pot pie, Ryan. That's what this town needs." The crowd rumbled in agreement. Claire sat frozen as the voices grew louder. "Why did I come here?" she thought bitterly. "I should have known I couldn't change anything." Ryan's voice cut through the noise. "This town doesn't need chicken pot pie, Clara. It needs something more. It needs a future." The room fell silent, shocked by the fire in his voice. "You all talk about my mother's legacy like I'm ruining it," Ryan continued, his words trembling with emotion. "But I loved her just as much as you did, and she would have wanted me to make this place my own." "Your own," Clara scoffed. "Or her own." She turned and pointed at Claire, still seated quietly in the back. The crowd turned in unison. Claire felt her face flush. She wanted to shrink into herself, to disappear. "Claire isn't the problem here," Ryan shot back, his voice firm. "She's shown me what's possible. She's shown me how much beauty this town has. Maybe you just don't want to see it." "You're turning against us, Ryan," old Joe growled. "Against the people who raised you." Ryan shook his head. "I'm not against anyone. I just want us to grow." The silence that followed was unbearable. Claire could feel the weight of every gaze on her, every ounce of judgment. She stood. The noise died down instantly. No one expected the quiet artist to speak. "I know I don't belong here," Claire said, her voice clear but trembling. "I know what you all say about me. And maybe you're right. I'm not from Willow Creek. I don't know everything about your town or your traditions, but I see the beauty here. I see it in the clock tower, in the river, in the market stalls. I see it in all of you." She paused, her gaze scanning the crowd. "All I've tried to do is capture that, to show you what you already have." The room was silent. Claire's words hung like a thread of light in the darkness. "I'm not here to change Willow Creek," she continued softer now. "I'm here to remind you that change doesn't mean forgetting who you are. It means growing into something even better." Claire's voice caught, but she pressed on. "If that's something you can't accept, then I'll leave." Ryan's head snapped toward her, his heart pounding. "Claire, I'll leave," she repeated, her eyes meeting his. "But you all should think about what you're really afraid of losing." That night, Claire returned to the clock tower. She stood before the unfinished mural, the paintbrush heavy in her hand. "You don't have to do this," Ryan said softly, appearing behind her. Claire turned, tears glimmering in her eyes. "I do. They need to see it, even if they don't want to." And so she painted. Through the night, with Ryan beside her, she painted the town as she saw it, flawed but beautiful, stuck but capable of moving forward. By dawn, the mural was complete. The clock tower stood surrounded by golden hues, its face radiant and alive, its hands painted to move forward once more. For the first time, Willow Creek had been given a glimpse of what it could become. The early morning light draped itself over Willow Creek like a thin veil of gold, illuminating the freshly painted mural on the clock tower. It was a masterpiece, subtle yet profound. The clock face was no longer stagnant, its hands elegantly frozen in the past. Instead, Claire had painted the hands in motion, forever moving forward, surrounded by strokes of warm amber, deep indigo, and soft coral hues. Willow Creek was alive on that wall. Its people, its markets, its winding cobblestone streets, all woven into a canvas of hope and possibility. As the first rays of sunlight kissed the mural, Ryan stood quietly beside Claire, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket. He looked at her work with awe, an unspoken pride swelling in his chest. "It's beautiful," he murmured. His voice broke the silence, but it was tender, reverent. Claire's gaze lingered on the mural before shifting to Ryan. "Do you think they'll see it? What it means?" Ryan exhaled softly, his breath visible in the crisp air. "They will, Claire. Maybe not right away, but they will." By mid-morning, the town square began to stir. The first to notice the mural were the children. They stared wide-eyed at the vibrant colors, tugging at their parents' sleeves to point out the beauty that had bloomed overnight. Slowly, the townsfolk gathered, forming a small but growing crowd in front of the clock tower. Clara Jenkins, always the first to voice her opinions, stood with her arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line. "It's bold," she finally muttered, her eyes narrowing. "Bold can be good," Old Joe said, surprising everyone. He tilted his hat back, gazing up at the mural with a soft squint. "Looks like someone finally decided to wake up this old town." Whispers rippled through the crowd, some admiring, others unsure. But no one could deny it. Something had changed. It was as though the mural itself had breathed new life into Willow Creek, a mirror reflecting both its flaws and its potential. Ryan watched the crowd from a distance, standing near the entrance of the Green Plate Diner. When he turned, he saw Claire lingering at the edge of the square, her face half hidden beneath the shadow of her hat. Her shoulders were tense, her fingers clenching the strap of her sketchbook. "You did this, Claire?" Ryan said softly, walking up beside her. She glanced up at him, her expression a mixture of relief and uncertainty. "I don't know if they'll ever really accept it. Or me." Ryan smiled faintly. "Change doesn't happen all at once. It starts small, like this. You've done more for this town than anyone's willing to admit." Claire bit her lip, the faintest flicker of a smile tugging at her mouth. "I couldn't have done it without you." Ryan shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. "You're the artist. I'm just a guy who makes food." Claire laughed quietly, the sound light against the tension still hanging in the air. "You do more than that, Ryan." A week later, Ryan entered the diner carrying a brown envelope. He had picked it up at the post office that morning and held it as though it carried something fragile. Claire sat at her usual table, hunched over her sketchbook. Her pencil moved in slow, thoughtful lines, as though each stroke carried the weight of her hopes and fears. She glanced up when she saw him approach, eyebrows raised. Ryan placed the envelope in front of her. "You know what this is." Claire hesitated, her fingers hovering over the flap. She knew. The statewide art competition. Ryan had found the opportunity for her weeks ago, hidden in the folds of a newspaper. It had felt impossible then, another chance to fail. But now, as the envelope sat before her, she felt her heart pounding in her chest, "You've worked for this," Ryan said gently. "Don't let fear decide for you." Claire took a shaky breath and picked up the envelope. She met Ryan's eyes, and for the first time in weeks, her voice was steady. "Okay, I'll do it." Meanwhile, Ryan was preparing for a different kind of leap. The community dinner he had been planning was set for the weekend, and he decided to unveil a new menu that blended tradition with innovation. Classic dishes his mother had taught him, infused with his own creativity. The days leading up to the dinner were long and filled with quiet determination. Ryan worked tirelessly in the kitchen, perfecting recipes that felt like a tribute to his mother, to Claire, and to himself. Claire helped where she could, painting new signs for the diner and sketching simple designs for the dinner's menu cards. Between paint strokes, she would glance at Ryan, watching him move through the kitchen with precision and purpose. There was a new energy about him, a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before. On the day of the dinner, the green plate was transformed. Soft yellow lights draped across the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the neatly arranged tables. Small vases of wildflowers sat at each table, and Claire's hand-painted menu cards added an elegant touch. As the first guests arrived, Ryan stood in the doorway, greeting each one with a warm smile. To his surprise, people actually came. Old Joe walked in with his granddaughter. Clara Jenkins arrived, reluctantly, but there nonetheless. Families, young couples, and even those who had been the diner's harshest critics filled the room. Claire watched from the corner of the diner, her heart swelling, as she saw Ryan move from table to table, delivering dishes that were met with surprised smiles and murmurs of approval. One dish in particular, a golden-crusted tart, drizzled with honey and topped with herbs, captured everyone's attention. "What is this?" Old Joe asked, holding up a forkful. Ryan grinned. "Something my mom never got to try. It's new, but it's made with everything she taught me." By the end of the night, the green plate was filled with laughter and conversation. The townsfolk left with full bellies and softened hearts, their earlier skepticism replaced with something much warmer: acceptance. Days later, Claire received an email. She had been selected as a finalist for the statewide art competition, and her mural, her reflection of Willow Creek, would be showcased in New York City. She sat on the edge of her bed, the email glowing on her laptop screen. Her heart raced, excitement mingling with fear. Ryan was the first person she told. "That's amazing, Claire," he said, his smile broad and genuine. But there was a shadow behind his eyes, a hint of sadness he couldn't quite hide. Claire noticed. "Ryan, I'm not leaving forever. I just need to do this, to prove to myself that I can." Ryan nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know. And you should. I'm proud of you." The words came easily, but they tasted bittersweet. He meant them, but he also knew that New York was a different world, one where Claire might find everything she'd ever wanted, and nothing that included him. The day Claire prepared to leave, the sun rose quietly over Willow Creek. Ryan stood outside the diner as she approached, a small suitcase in one hand and her sketchbook in the other. "I'll be back," Claire said, her voice soft but resolute. Ryan managed to smile. "You'd better be." She stepped closer, hesitating for just a moment, before throwing her arms around him. Ryan held her tightly, his throat tight, with everything he wanted to say but couldn't. "Good luck, Claire," he whispered. "You too, Ryan?" As she walked toward the waiting car, Ryan watched her go, his hands shoved into his pockets to keep them from trembling. The green plate felt a little emptier that day, but Ryan knew this wasn't the end of their story. It was just a new chapter. The train rumbled steadily along the tracks, carrying Claire away, from the quiet familiarity of Willow Creek. She sat by the window, her sketchbook tucked under her arm, and watched the rolling fields and distant mountains blur past like faint memories. The early morning sunlight poured through the glass, warm but indifferent. New York City awaited her, the city that had once rejected her, the city she was now returning to as a finalist in the statewide art competition. Her mind raced with thoughts, emotions swirling into an indistinguishable mess. "I'll be back," she had promised Ryan that morning, her voice steady but her heart uncertain. And now, as the miles stretched between them, she couldn't help but feel the bittersweet weight of those words. New York City was as overwhelming as she remembered. The streets pulsed with energy, the sidewalks overflowing with people moving with relentless purpose. Skyscrapers loomed overhead, their glass facades reflecting the busy world below. Claire clutched her portfolio tightly to her chest as she weaved through the crowd, heading toward the gallery where the competition finalists would be showcasing their work. The gallery itself was an oasis of calm amidst the city's chaos. High ceilings, polished floors, and pristine white walls adorned with art from the competition's other finalists. Claire's mural was displayed prominently in the main hall, larger than life, its vibrant colors capturing Willow Creek in all its charm and complexity. The clock tower, the markets, the people, each stroke told a story. Claire stepped back to take it in. Seeing her work in this space, surrounded by other talented artists, felt surreal. For years, she had fought to have her art recognized, and now that it was here, she found herself oddly detached. She overheard whispers as patrons studied her mural. "It's so simple," someone remarked. "Charming," said another, in a tone that felt more patronizing than complimentary. "Very small town." Claire's chest tightened, but she kept her face composed. Small town. The phrase echoed in her mind. An old wound reopened. Had she come all this way, just to have her work reduced to a label once more? She turned away, clutching her sketchbook as if it could anchor her. The days leading up to the award ceremony were a blur of receptions, interviews, and gallery tours. Claire moved through it all like a ghost, her heart half present. On paper, she was living her dream. She was here, among New York's artistic elite, showcasing her work to critics, curators, and collectors. But something felt off. At night, she sat alone in a small hotel room, staring at the city lights through the window. She'd call Willow Creek in those quiet hours, but the phone would ring until it went to voicemail. Ryan was busy. She knew that, but a small part of her ached to hear his voice. One evening, as Claire sat at a rooftop reception, surrounded by clinking glasses and conversations that danced around her, a fellow finalist, Isabelle Laurent, approached her. Isabelle was polished and confident, with sharp cheekbones and a sharp tongue to match. "Claire Bennett, right?" Isabelle said, her smile as smooth as glass. "Your mural is different." Claire turned to her, brow furrowing slightly. "Thank you? Where are you from again? Some little town in Oregon?" "Willow Creek," Claire replied, her voice firm but quiet. Isabel's smile widened. "Willow Creek. How quaint." She sipped her champagne, then added, "You know, Claire, there's a certain scale to art that galleries here expect. What works in a small town doesn't always translate to a city audience." The words stung, but Claire swallowed her retort. She turned back to the skyline, letting Isabel's voice fade into the background. The doubts she had worked so hard to silence began to creep back in. What if I don't belong here? Back in Willow Creek, Ryan stood in the kitchen of the Green Plate, staring at an empty dining room. The community dinner had been a success, but the buzz had quickly faded. The regulars returned to their burgers and pies, and Ryan's new dishes sat untouched on the chalkboard menu. Clara Jenkins had been the first to comment, as always. "What's with this rosemary tart nonsense? We don't need all that fancy cooking, Ryan." Even old Joe seemed skeptical. "You know me, son. I like my meals hearty and simple." Ryan leaned heavily against the counter, rubbing his temples. The financial strain of keeping the diner afloat weighed on him more than ever. With Claire gone, the corner table she used to occupy sat empty, a constant reminder of her absence. He missed her, not just her sketches or her ideas, but her presence, her quiet way of seeing beauty where no one else did. And yet, a part of him felt ashamed. While Claire was out chasing her dream, here he was, stuck in the same place he'd always been. "You're the one holding yourself back," he remembered her saying once. Ryan looked out the window at the mural on the clock tower, its colors glowing softly in the evening light. Claire had believed in change, even when no one else did. Maybe it was time he started believing in it too. The night of the award ceremony arrived with fanfare and anticipation. The gallery was filled with patrons and critics dressed in their finest. Claire stood near her mural, wearing a simple black dress that felt out of place amidst the extravagance. A hush fell over the room as the announcer stepped onto the small stage. "And the winner of this year's statewide art competition is..." Claire held her breath, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Isabelle Laurent, for Urban Eco." Applause erupted as Isabelle stepped forward, her confidence radiating through the crowd. Claire's heart sank, but she forced herself to clap along. She should have known. Her mural, with its small-town charm, was never going to win here. As the ceremony continued, Claire slipped out of the gallery and onto the street. The cool night air hit her like a splash of water. She leaned against the building, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text message from Ryan. "Saw your mural online. It's incredible, Claire. Proud of you." Claire stared at the words, tears pricking her eyes. She typed out a reply, but her hands faltered. "I didn't win. I don't think I belong here." She hit send, her chest tightening as she waited for a response. It came quickly. "You belong wherever your art takes you. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Claire smiled faintly, wiping at her eyes. For the first time in days, she felt a spark of warmth. The next morning, Claire boarded a train back to Willow Creek. As the city receded behind her, she felt a strange sense of peace. Winning had never been the point. It was about proving to herself that she could try, that she could stand tall in the face of rejection. Willow Creek's familiar skyline greeted her as the train pulled into the station. The clock tower, the diner, the people, everything was exactly as she had left it. And yet it felt different, warmer, more alive. Ryan was standing by the platforms, hands shoved in his pockets, a faint smile on his lips, as Claire stepped off the train. "Hey," he said softly. "Hey," she replied, her voice carrying a mix of exhaustion and relief. Ryan looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "Welcome home, Claire." And for the first time, Claire truly felt that she was. The soft hum of the Green Plate's kitchen filled the air as Ryan stood by the stove, staring at a pot of simmering soup. It was quiet, a stillness that was once a comfort, but now felt like a weight pressing against his chest. He absent-mindedly stirred the broth, the steam rising around him, like the haze of his thoughts. Claire had been gone for 2 weeks. The days dragged on in Willow Creek, slow and uneventful. The townsfolk carried on with their routines, as if nothing had changed. But for Ryan, everything felt off. The diner's once familiar rhythm now seemed hollow. without Claire sitting in her corner, sketching quietly with that faint crease of concentration on her brow. The green plate felt incomplete. Ryan glanced toward the empty table by the window, Claire's table. Her absence left a space in the room, and in him, that he couldn't seem to fill. For Claire, New York had quickly become a whirlwind of noise, lights, and expectations. Her days were packed with gallery tours and meetings, her evenings spent sketching. In the small, lonely studio apartment the gallery had rented for her, the city that had once rejected her now seemed eager to claim her. And yet, every praise, every offer, felt empty. Late one night, Claire sat on the cold hardwood floor of her apartment, surrounded by scattered sketches. Her fingers were smudged with charcoal, her hair pulled back loosely. She stared at a half-finished drawing of Willow Creek, the clock tower, the diner, the market stalls, all captured with delicate strokes of her pencil. Her phone buzzed beside her, breaking the silence. A message from Ryan flashed on the screen. "How's the big city treating you?" Claire hesitated, then typed out a reply. "Busy. Lots to do. How's Willow Creek?" A moment later, Ryan's response came through. "Same as always. Still serving up burgers and pie. Old Joe says he misses seeing your weird city sketches." Claire laughed softly, a rare sound in the still apartment. She could almost hear Ryan's voice in his words, his sarcasm laced with a quiet warmth. For a moment, the loneliness that had settled in her chest seemed to lift. But as she set her phone down, a lingering thought crept in. Why doesn't this feel right? She had worked so hard for this, for recognition, for success. And yet, New York didn't feel like home. Success here felt hollow, without someone to share it with. Back in Willow Creek, the green plate was struggling more than ever. Ryan had tried to introduce new dishes, inspired by Claire's ideas, but the town's stubborn resistance remained. Each day, fewer customers filled the diner, and Ryan began to see the cracks forming, both in his business and in himself. One afternoon, Clara Jenkins approached the counter, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You're losing customers, Ryan," she said bluntly. "This town doesn't need fancy food. We need what we've always had. Tradition. Stability." Ryan clenched his jaw, wiping his hands on a towel. "People will come around, Clara. They just need time. Or maybe they won't," she replied with a sigh. "Look, we all loved your mother. She knew what this place needed. But you're trying to change too much. You're not her, Ryan." The words hit him harder than he expected. After Clara left, Ryan sank onto a stool behind the counter, rubbing his temples. His mother's memory loomed over him like a shadow. She had run this diner for decades, crafting meals that were simple, familiar, and loved. Now, he felt like he was failing her, and everyone else. Was Clara right? Was he trying to be something he wasn't? His gaze drifted toward Claire's empty table once again. She had always believed in change, in pushing beyond what was familiar. What would she say if she were here? That evening, Claire sat in her apartment, scrolling through the emails flooding her inbox, offers to showcase her art in other galleries, requests for commissions, interviews with magazines. She should have felt proud, but instead, it all felt heavy. A notification popped up. An email from the Willow Creek Library. Curious, Claire clicked on it. The email contained an image, a photo of her mural on the clock tower, bathed in soft evening light, with a caption beneath it that read, "A symbol of hope for a town learning to embrace change." Claire's heart swelled as she stared at the photo. She could almost hear the soft hum of the town square, the distant chatter of townsfolk, and the ticking of the clock tower. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, and without thinking, she typed out a reply to Ryan's last message. I miss it there. The next morning, Ryan opened Claire's text while standing in the kitchen, the sunlight streaming through the diner's window. He stared at the words for a long time, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. I miss it there. It wasn't much, but it was enough to stir something inside him. He thought of Claire's mural, her sketches of Willow Creek, the quiet way she had seen beauty in a town that so many had overlooked. She had shown him what it meant to dream, to step outside the walls he had built for himself. Ryan glanced at the chalkboard menu, the same specials written in neat cursive. Burgers, fries, chicken soup. He grabbed an eraser and wiped it clean. Ryan spent the next few days revamping the diner. He didn't announce it to anyone, didn't ask for permission. He simply rolled up his sleeves and got to work. He tried new recipes, dishes inspired by the markets of Willow Creek, by the sunset Claire had once sketched, by the small moments that gave the town its charm. The diner began to smell different, brighter, richer. Customers noticed. Some turned up their noses, but others leaned in with curiosity. "What's that?" Old Joe asked, pointing to a dish with fresh herbs sprinkled across it. Ryan grinned. "Just something new. Give it a try." Old Joe hesitated, then shrugged. "Why not?" A week later, Ryan was standing in the kitchen when the diner's front door opened and the small brass bell chimed. He glanced up, his hands pausing mid-motion. Claire stood in the doorway, her sketchbook tucked under her arm, her face lit by the soft afternoon glow. For a moment, they just stared at each other, as if the space between them had vanished entirely. "Claire," Ryan said, his voice quiet but full of emotion. "Hey," she replied softly, stepping inside. She glanced around, noticing the changes, the menu, the new dishes, the fresh life in the space. "You've been busy," she said with a small smile. "So have you," Ryan replied, his gaze steady on her. "But you're here." Claire nodded, her smile widening. "Yeah, I'm here." Ryan set down the dish he had been preparing and walked over to her, wiping his hands on his apron. "Welcome home, Claire." Claire exhaled, her shoulders softening. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she could breathe again. The gentle hum of tires on gravel broke the quiet serenity of Willow Creek as a familiar bus rolled into town. The morning air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of pine and the distant smoke from chimneys warming sleepy homes. The sun crept above the horizon, casting long shadows over the cobblestone streets and the clock tower at the heart of town. Claire stepped off the bus, clutching her well-worn sketchbook to her chest. She inhaled deeply, the air tasting different, softer, warmer than the metallic buzz of New York. As her boots touched the ground, the first thing she noticed was how still everything seemed. No honking cars, no hurried footsteps, just the slow, rhythmic pulse of a small town waking up. The bus pulled away, leaving Claire standing alone on the edge of the square. She took a step forward, her gaze traveling across familiar landmarks. The old clock tower, the cafe she used to visit, and, of course, Ryan's diner, the Green Plate, anchoring the far corner of the square. It looked different now. The sign above the door had been repainted, its green lettering fresh and vibrant. The windows glowed softly from the lights within, and potted herbs lined the sills, a small but telling change. Claire's heart skipped a beat. "Ryan!" She adjusted the strap of her bag and walked toward the diner, her steps slow and deliberate. Inside the Green Plate, Ryan was busy wiping down the counter, his brow furrowed in concentration. He moved with a practiced rhythm, scrubbing, organizing, placing silverware into neat rows. He had started early that morning, a habit he had picked up since Claire left. Keeping busy kept the silence at bay. The small brass bell above the door chimed, breaking his focus. Ryan turned around, expecting another regular, perhaps old Joe or Mrs. Jenkins, with her usual order of tea. But when his eyes met Claire's, the rag in his hand fell to the floor. For a moment, they just stared at each other. Claire smiled, a shy, hesitant curve of her lips. "Hey," she said softly. Ryan blinked, as if unsure whether she was real. "Claire?" he breathed. "You're back." Claire stepped inside, her fingers tracing the edge of the counter as she walked toward him. "Yeah, I needed to come back." Ryan swallowed, trying to find his voice. "New York, didn't—" He trailed off, unsure of what he was asking. "It didn't feel like home," Claire replied, her eyes steady on his. "But this does." Ryan stared at her for a long moment, his chest rising and falling as he processed her words. Then, without another word, he pulled her into a hug. Claire froze for half a second before melting into the embrace. It wasn't dramatic or rushed, just a quiet, heartfelt connection between two people who had been apart for far too long. "You don't know how much I needed this," Ryan whispered. Claire smiled against his shoulder. "Me too." They sat together at Claire's old table by the window, the morning light streaming in and catching the faint dust motes in the air. Ryan placed a cup of tea in front of her, steaming, fragrant, and familiar. "Oh, everything looks different," Claire said, glancing around. "But in a good way." Ryan followed her gaze. "I made a few changes after you left. It felt like the right time." Claire nodded, her expression soft. "The herbs on the windows, the new menu. I noticed." Ryan chuckled, though there was a hint of nervousness in his voice. "It hasn't been easy. People aren't big fans of change, as you know." Claire smirked. "Tell me about it." "But," Ryan continued, "it's getting better. Slowly. Some people are starting to come around." Claire sipped her tea, her heart swelling with quiet pride. "I knew you could do it." Ryan met her gaze. "You were the one who gave me the courage to try." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken thoughts lingering between them. Finally, Claire reached for her sketchbook and flipped it open. The pages were filled with scenes from New York, skylines, subways, distant figures caught in hurried moments. But the most recent drawing stood out. The Willow Creek clock tower, bathed in soft light. "I sketched it the day I decided to come back," Claire said, her voice hushed. Ryan leaned closer, taking in the details. "You captured it perfectly." Claire looked up at him, her eyes searching. "Ryan, I didn't just come back for Willow Creek." Ryan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "I came back for you," Claire finished softly. Ryan let out a shaky breath, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Claire, you don't know how many times I almost called you. I thought you were better off out there. In New York. Living your dream." Claire reached across the table, her fingers brushing against his hand. "A dream doesn't mean anything if you can't share it with someone who matters." Ryan's smile grew. "You're right." The next few days were filled with life, color, and purpose. Claire fell into her routine, as if she had never left, sketching quiet corners of Willow Creek, visiting the market, and drinking tea at the green plate. Ryan watched her work with quiet admiration, her creativity breathing new energy into the diner and into his life. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Claire set down her pencil and stretched her arms, glancing toward Ryan. "I've been thinking," she said. "The diner needs something more." Ryan looked up from where he was chopping vegetables. "Oh?" Claire grinned. "A fresh mural. Inside. Something that ties together food, art, and the heart of Willow Creek." Ryan considered it for a moment, then smiled. I like it. You're the artist. Hey, show me what you've got. In the days that followed, Claire and Ryan worked side by side, transforming the green plate into something more than a diner. The walls became canvases. Claire painted sprawling murals of the Willow Creek Clock Tower, the market, and the rolling hills surrounding the town. Each brushstroke told a story, weaving together the beauty of the community with the warmth of the diner. Ryan, inspired by Claire's creativity, began to experiment even further in the kitchen. He crafted dishes that combined tradition and innovation, naming some of them after Claire's sketches. The Clock Tower Lemon Tart and the Market Square Herb Soup became instant favorites. As word spread, the diner's tables began to fill. Townsfolk who had once resisted change now lingered longer, admiring Claire's artwork and savoring Ryan's food. The green plate, now affectionately renamed the Hearth, became a gathering place for the entire community. One evening, after the last customer had left and the diner was quiet again, Claire and Ryan stood in the center of the room, taking it all in. The soft glow of the hanging lights illuminated the murals, the polished tables, and the small details they had worked so hard to create. Claire looked at Ryan, her voice full of emotion. "We did it," Ryan smiled, his gaze steady on hers. "Yeah, we did." Claire took his hand, squeezing it gently. "This place, it's not just yours or mine. It's ours." Ryan nodded, his voice soft. "And it's just the beginning." Outside, the clock tower chimed softly, its sound echoing across the quiet streets of Willow Creek. For the first time in years, the town didn't feel stagnant or frozen in time. It felt alive, filled with possibility, and Claire and Ryan knew they had built something lasting, not just for themselves, but for everyone. As they stood there, the faint hum of the town wrapped around them, grounding them in the place where it had all begun. The morning light filtered through the large refurbished windows of the diner, now renamed the Hearth. The air buzzed with a newfound energy, the kind of hum that comes from possibilities realized. Claire stood at the far wall, a paintbrush held loosely in her hand, as she stepped back to admire her work. The mural was nearly complete, an expansive depiction of Willow Creek's history and heart. The clock tower, rolling hills, farmers in the market, and the warm glow of families gathering inside the diner. Every brushstroke carried a story. Her breath caught in her chest as she traced the lines with her gaze. This place, which had once been stagnant and unmoving, was changing. They were changing it. From behind her, the soft sound of footsteps broke the stillness. Ryan emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, a faint streak of flour dusting his forehead. "You're still at it?" he teased, his voice low and warm. Claire turned, grinning as she tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "Someone has to make this place look beautiful. You can't do all the heavy lifting." Ryan chuckled, his gaze flickering between Claire and the mural. "You've outdone yourself, Claire. It's perfect." She shook her head modestly, but couldn't hide the flicker of pride in her eyes. "It's not perfect yet, but it's getting there. Like everything else." Ryan crossed his arms, leaning against the doorway as he watched her. "This place feels alive now. It's not just a diner anymore." Claire tilted her head, watching him carefully. It's not just a diner. It's a home for food, for art, for people to come together." He nodded slowly, the weight of their shared dream pressing down on him, not as a burden, but as a blessing. The idea had started small. The Hearth would be a place that merged food and art, where creativity thrived in both the kitchen and on the walls. But over the next few weeks, their vision expanded, fueled by the energy that rippled through Willow Creek. Claire's mural drew people in. Visitors from neighboring towns came to admire the art, snapping photos and marveling at the intricate details. Ryan's menu, a blend of the town's traditions and his own innovative flair, quickly became the talk of the region. Each dish told a story, its flavors deliberate and bold. Ryan leaned over the counter one afternoon, watching as a family enjoyed a meal together. The father broke off a piece of bread, sharing it with his young son, who grinned widely as he chewed. Claire walked up beside him, her arms crossed as she took in the scene. "Look at that." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "At what?" Claire smiled softly. "You brought this place back to life, Ryan. You gave them something to connect over." He glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "And you gave them something to see, something to inspire them. It's not just the food, Claire. It's what you've created." Claire's cheek warmed as she ducked her head. "It was both of us." As the hearth grew in popularity, Claire and Ryan began to dream bigger. They hosted community art workshops on Sunday mornings, where Claire taught families and children how to sketch and paint. A small studio space, once a storage closet, was repurposed with easels, jars of paintbrushes, and shelves of sketch pads. "Don't worry about it being perfect," Claire told a hesitant young boy one afternoon, kneeling beside him as he held a trembling pencil. "Art isn't about perfection. It's about telling a story. Your story." The boy glanced at her, his eyes wide with uncertainty. "But what if it looks bad?" Claire smiled gently. "Then it's just part of the journey. Every artist starts somewhere." The boy nodded slowly, pressing his pencil to the page, his movements cautious at first, before they grew more confident. Claire watched him with pride, her heart swelling. In his small act of bravery, she saw a reflection of her younger self, hungry to create, but unsure of her place in the world. Meanwhile, Ryan transformed the diner's back kitchen into a culinary workshop on quiet weekday evenings. Young chefs, some of them teenagers who had never set foot in a professional kitchen, watched eagerly as Ryan demonstrated new techniques. "This isn't just cooking," Ryan explained, guiding a teenager's hands as he rolled dough for fresh bread. "It's about expressing yourself. Every dish you make is yours. It's your voice." A young girl with a smudge of flour on her cheek asked nervously, "But what if no one likes it?" Ryan smiled knowingly. "Then you try again. That's the beauty of cooking. It's never final. You get as many chances as you need." Under Ryan's careful guidance, the teenagers experimented with spices, flavors, and recipes. The pride on their faces when they presented a completed dish to their families made every late night worth it. Despite the growing excitement, challenges remained. Some of Willow Creek's older residents still resisted change, grumbling about the fancy dishes and the strange art taking over their diner. "You're losing what made this place special, Ryan," an older man named Mr. Callahan said one evening, his voice firm but not unkind. Ryan sighed, setting down a steaming plate in front of him. "Mr. Callahan, I know this place means a lot to you. It means a lot to me too. But I promise you, the heart of it hasn't changed." Mr. Callahan grunted, but took a bite of his food. Ryan watched nervously, waiting for a reaction. After a long silence, the older man nodded begrudgingly. "It's different," he said, chewing thoughtfully, "but it's good." Ryan grinned. Different doesn't have to be bad. Over time, even the most skeptical townsfolk began to soften. It wasn't just the food or the art. It was the sense of belonging that the hearth fostered. People who had once judged Claire for being an outsider now stopped to compliment her work. Families who had been hesitant to try Ryan's dishes now lingered longer, sharing stories over dessert. Late one evening, as the last of the day's patrons departed, Claire and Ryan sat together at a table near the mural. The diner was quiet, save for the faint hum of the lights and the creak of the floorboards. Claire leaned back in her chair, staring at the mural she had painted. "You know, when I first got here, I never thought this was possible." Ryan looked at her, his expression warm. "Neither did I." Claire turned to him, her voice soft. "But you believed in it anyway. You believed in me." Ryan held her gaze for a moment, before replying, "Because I knew you had something this town needed, even if they didn't see it yet." Claire smiled, a small, quiet smile that spoke volumes. "And you had something I needed too. A reason to believe in myself again." Ryan reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "We did this together." Claire nodded, squeezing his hand gently. "And we're just getting started." The morning sun bathed the hearth in a soft golden glow, casting long rays across the polished wooden floors and the murals that adorned its walls. The diner was alive with sound and movement, chairs being arranged, the faint hiss of pans heating on the stove, and the murmur of voices mingling with the clink of silverware. Claire stood by the mural she had just completed, a sweeping panorama of Willow Creek. It told the story of the town through images: the steadfast clock tower, the market bustling with life, children playing in the town square, and the hearth glowing warmly at the center. It was more than a painting. It was a tapestry of memories and hopes, stitched together with care. From across the room, Ryan glanced up, wiping his hands on his apron. He paused, watching Claire as she touched up the final strokes. "Still perfecting it?" he teased, walking over with a small grin. Claire turned, smiling. "It's done now. I think this one's ready." Ryan stepped back, folding his arms as he took in the mural. "It's beautiful, Claire. It's like the story of us." Claire's cheeks flushed faintly, but she nodded. "It's everyone's story. Ours, the town's, yours. It's what the hearth has become." That evening marked the grand reopening of the hearth. Ryan and Claire had invited the entire town, spreading word through flyers pinned to storefronts, emails sent to nearby communities, and whispered excitement passed between neighbors. The diner, once a quiet corner of Willow Creek, now buzzed with curiosity. The clock struck 6, as families and individuals began arriving, the soft chatter of voices filling the space. Ryan stood near the entrance, his smile wide and welcoming, as he greeted each guest. "Welcome. Come on in. Find a seat anywhere," he said warmly, shaking hands and nodding to familiar faces. Claire, perched near the mural, observed the scene with a mix of nervousness and excitement. Children pressed their faces close to the vibrant artwork, pointing at details with wide eyes. A few adults murmured in appreciation, their skepticism fading as they absorbed the care and meaning behind each brushstroke. From the kitchen, tantalizing aromas began to drift into the dining room. Ryan's new menu was a bold mix of tradition and innovation. Chicken pot pie, infused with fresh herbs from local gardens, roasted vegetables drizzled in unexpected spices, and delicate lemon tarts that melted on the tongue. Every dish had a story, inspired by Claire's sketches and the town's memories. "Try this," Ryan said to a group of elderly women, carefully placing a small plate of savory pastries on their table. "It's an old recipe, but I gave it a little twist." One woman raised an eyebrow as she picked up the pastry. "A twist, huh?" Ryan smiled, unfazed. "Just trust me." The women exchanged glances before taking small, tentative bites. Their expressions shifted almost immediately, eyebrows lifting, lips curling into smiles. "This is wonderful," one of them admitted, dabbing her mouth with a napkin. "I told you," Ryan replied, grinning. Claire watched it all unfold, her heart swelling with pride. The diner was alive in a way it had never been before. Children laughing, couples leaning close to share bites, families lingering long after their plates were empty. Despite the warm reception, there were still pockets of doubt. Mr. Callahan, a gruff man in his late 60s, who had frequented the diner for years, sat in his usual corner with his arms crossed. The new menu was open before him, but his scowl was fixed. "What's wrong, Mr. Callahan?" Ryan asked gently as he approached the table, a steaming plate in hand. The older man grunted, "Where's the meatloaf? I don't see it anywhere." Ryan suppressed a smile. "I took the meatloaf off for tonight, but I've got something better for you. Just try it." Mr. Callahan eyed the plate suspiciously, but took a bite anyway. The flavors surprised him, savory and comforting, but elevated with a hint of something new. He chewed slowly, setting down his fork, with a grunt of reluctant approval. "Well, it's not meatloaf," he muttered, "but it'll do." Ryan patted his shoulder, his grin triumphant. "I'll take that as a win." Nearby, Claire witnessed the exchange and shook her head with amusement. "Winning hearts, one plate at a time," she murmured to herself. As the evening progressed, Claire's mural began to draw a crowd. Children pointed out the little details she had hidden throughout. Tiny butterflies painted in corners, a cat perched on a windowsill, and a family walking under the shadow of the clock tower. One teenager, a boy with paint-streaked hands, approached Claire hesitantly. "Miss Bennett?" Claire turned, surprised. "Yes." The boy shifted awkwardly, holding up a worn sketchbook. I want to draw, but I don't think I'm any good. Do you think you could show me how to get better?" Claire's heart swelled. She crouched down to his level, her smile encouraging. "The only way to get better is to keep going. Let me see what you've drawn." The boy opened his sketchbook, revealing rough but earnest drawings of trees, birds, and small scenes from around town. "These are wonderful," Claire said genuinely, flipping through the pages. "You've got a great eye. Keep practicing and don't be afraid to mess up. Art isn't perfect, it's just honest." The boy's face lit up with hope. "Thank you, Miss Bennett. Maybe I'll try painting something bigger." Claire reached into her bag and handed him a small set of paintbrushes. "Start with these, and let me know when you're ready. I'll help you with whatever you need." From across the room, Ryan watched the interaction, his heart swelling with pride. Claire had done more than paint murals or bring in customers. She had sparked inspiration. The night drew to a close, but no one seemed eager to leave. The hearth had become more than just a place for food. It was a gathering space, a hub of warmth and creativity. As Ryan and Claire stood together near the entrance, they watched families linger over desserts and children chase each other playfully around the tables. "This is everything we wanted," Claire said softly, leaning her head against Ryan's shoulder. Ryan nodded, his voice filled with quiet pride. "It's more than I ever imagined." From outside, the clock tower chimed, its familiar sound carrying through the night air. The mural caught the golden glow of the streetlights, and for the first time, it felt like the heart of Willow Creek was beating again. As they locked up for the night, Ryan paused, turning to Claire. "We did it." Claire smiled, taking his hand in hers. "No, Ryan. The hearth isn't just ours. It's everyone's now." And in that moment, under the quiet stars and the glow of the mural, they knew that the hearth had become more than a restaurant. It was a legacy of change, of courage, and of hope. The days turned into weeks, and the hearth became an undeniable symbol of renewal in Willow Creek. For the first time in decades, there was a hum of energy running through the town. It was as if the very air had shifted, lighter, brighter, and filled with possibility. The once skeptical townsfolk now gathered in the hearth like clockwork, filling the space with chatter and laughter. New faces began to appear as well, visitors from neighboring towns who had heard whispers of the charming diner with its painted walls and extraordinary food. Claire often stood back and watched the transformation in awe, her heart swelling with pride, as she observed families and friends sharing moments that seemed almost sacred. She saw children studying the mural, young artists sketching at the corner tables, and Ryan bustling between the kitchen and dining room, with a lightness she had never seen before. One crisp Saturday morning, Claire arrived early at the hearth to set up for her art workshop. Outside, the town square was alive with its usual rhythm. Vendors setting up stalls, people chatting as they passed, and the Willow Creek clock tower standing as a silent guardian over it all. Inside, a dozen young artists, ranging from wide-eyed children to curious teenagers, were already seated at tables covered in brown paper, palettes of paint and brushes waiting for them. Claire clapped her hands gently to gain their attention. "Good morning, everyone," she said warmly. "Today we're going to learn how to tell stories through art. I want you to think about something that inspires you. Maybe it's a place, a person, or even a small memory, and let that guide your painting." A young girl raised her hand timidly. "But what if it's not good enough?" Claire smiled, kneeling beside her. "There's no such thing as not good enough in art. Every brushstroke you make tells part of your story, and that's what matters. Just start, and let yourself enjoy it." The girl nodded, her confidence bolstered. Soon the room was filled with the quiet hum of creativity. Claire moved between tables, offering gentle encouragement and suggestions. She watched as once nervous hands grew steadier, and colors began to bloom across the canvases. "Miss Bennett?" one boy called out, holding up his painting. It was rough, but there was undeniable heart in it. A simple depiction of the hearth, glowing brightly under a night sky. Claire's chest tightened with emotion. "That's beautiful," she said, her voice soft but sincere. "You captured the heart of this place perfectly." The boy beamed, pride lighting up his face. In that moment, Claire realized that her journey had come full circle. Years ago, she had been the child filled with doubt and fear. Now, she was the one passing the torch, nurturing dreams the way Ryan had done for her. At the same time, Ryan was in the kitchen, surrounded by a group of teenagers eager to learn the secrets of his cooking. "All right," he said, rolling up his sleeves. "Who here has made bread before?" A few hands went up hesitantly. Ryan grinned. "Good. Today we're not just making bread. We're making something special. This recipe was my mother's, but I've added my own twist to it. That's what cooking is all about. Taking what you know and making it your own." As the teens kneaded dough, flour dusting their hands and clothes, Ryan moved between them, guiding their movements. One boy, frustrated by the stickiness of his dough, sighed loudly. "This isn't working," he muttered. Ryan crouched beside him, his tone calm and patient. "It's all right. Bread takes time and care. You've got to trust the process, even if it feels messy. Keep going." The boy hesitated, but followed Ryan's advice, his frustration slowly giving way to focus. By the time the loaves were in the oven, the kitchen was filled with the rich, comforting scent of fresh bread. When the bread was done, Ryan set one golden loaf in front of each teenager. "You did this," he said, his voice full of pride. "See? Even when it feels impossible, you can create something amazing." The teens cheered as they tasted their work, their faces lighting up with excitement. Ryan leaned against the counter, watching them with a quiet smile. For so long, he had felt trapped in his mother's legacy. Now he realized he wasn't just preserving it, he was transforming it, breathing new life into something he loved. News of the hearth spread far beyond Willow Creek. Local newspapers featured articles about the diner's transformation and the way it had brought the town together. Claire's mural became a point of pride, drawing visitors who lingered to take photos and admire its details. Ryan's new dishes were the talk of the region, simple yet innovative, crafted with love and care. People came from miles away to taste the food, curious to see what made this small-town diner so special. One day, a journalist from a national magazine arrived to interview Ryan and Claire. She sat with them at a corner table, her notepad open and pen poised. "Tell me," she said, "what inspired all of this? How did the hearth become what it is today?" Ryan glanced at Claire, their eyes meeting with a shared understanding. "It wasn't just us," Ryan said. "It was the town. The people here gave us the chance to try, to fail, to learn, and to grow. This place is as much theirs as it is ours." Claire nodded. "We wanted to create a space where people could dream again, whether it's art, food, or just sharing a meal with someone you care about. The hearth is about finding light in the small things." The journalist smiled as she jotted down their words. "It sounds like you've built something truly special." Claire looked around the room. The laughter, the warmth, the life that filled every corner. "We have." That evening, after the last customer had left and the lights were dimmed, Claire and Ryan sat together outside the hearth. The night air was cool, and the stars sparkled overhead. Ryan leaned back in his chair, gazing at the mural. "You know, I never thought I'd see this place like this." Claire smiled, her voice soft. "Neither did I. But I think we always had it in us. We just needed a reason to try." Ryan turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "Do you ever miss Seattle? The galleries? The city?" Claire considered his question, then shook her head. I think I was always searching for something more. I didn't realize it until I came here. But success doesn't mean leaving. It means finding a place where you can grow and give back." Ryan nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the glowing diner. "This is our place, Claire. And we've made it better. Together." Claire reached for his hand, her fingers curling gently around his. "We did." In the quiet of the night, they sat side by side, two dreamers who had found their way back to themselves and to each other. As the golden light fades on Willow Creek and the hearth glows like a quiet beacon of hope, we're left with one thought. The power of dreams isn't in how far we go, but in how much light we share along the way. What part of Claire and Ryan's journey resonated with you the most? Was it their quiet resilience, their courage to face the unknown, or the way they brought life back to their town? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. And if you believe in stories that remind us of the beauty in small beginnings, hit that subscribe button and join us for the next tale of love, resilience, and hope. Because sometimes, the greatest journeys start right where you are. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you again soon with another story that warms the heart and stirs the soul. The morning air was crisp and tinged with the subtle sense of autumn. Damp earth, fallen leaves, and a hint of something new on the horizon. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the hearth, painting the wooden floor in stripes of golden light. Today wasn't just another day in Willow Creek. It was a celebration of dreams realized, of lives changed, and of a community reborn. Claire stood by the front door of the hearth, gazing at the steady stream of people arriving for the art exhibition. Families, couples, and groups of children walked through the entrance, some clutching sketchbooks, others carrying notebooks or cameras to capture the event. She smoothed her dress nervously, a deep blue fabric, dotted with faint white patterns. It wasn't glamorous, Claire wasn't the type, but it made her feel grounded, confident. Ryan had insisted she take this moment in stride. "You earned this," he had said earlier that morning, his voice steady and reassuring. "Don't let yourself forget that." "Claire," a familiar voice called. She turned to see Ryan walking toward her, a fresh tray of pastries, balanced expertly in his hands. A faint smear of flour still dusted his cheek, but his smile was bright, his expression warm. "You're missing it," Ryan teased, nodding toward the growing crowd inside. "Everyone's already buzzing about your work." Claire laughed lightly, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I just needed a minute to breathe." Ryan set the tray down and studied her, his gaze unwavering. "You've spent so long running away, Claire. Now, you get to stand still and see what you've built." Claire's chest tightened with emotion. For so long, she had been haunted by rejection, by her own insecurities, and by the fear of failing again. But as she looked back at the hearth, at the people who filled its space with energy and light, she realized something profound. She was no longer running. Inside, the walls of the hearth were adorned with Claire's work, paintings and sketches of Willow Creek's quiet beauty. Her mural of the clock tower stood out as the centerpiece, its colors vibrant and full of life, a symbolic representation of the town's transformation. Alongside it were smaller pieces, scenes from the market, children laughing by the river, even Ryan standing behind the counter of the diner, caught mid-laughter. Claire moved through the crowd, listening to the whispers of awe that floated through the air. A young girl tugged on her sleeve, holding up a crumpled piece of paper with her own drawing, a wobbly rendition of the clock tower. "Miss Bennett," the girl said shyly, "I made this for you." Claire knelt to meet the girl's eye level, a warm smile spreading across her face. "It's beautiful. You've captured the heart of this town perfectly." The girl's face lit up. "Do you think I could be an artist too?" Claire felt a lump rise in her throat. Memories of her younger self, flashing in her mind, doubting, dreaming, and searching for someone to believe in her. "You already are," Claire said softly. "Never stop drawing, okay?" As the girl beamed and ran back to her family, Claire caught Ryan's eye across the room. He was leaning against the kitchen doorway, watching her with a proud, quiet smile. The exhibition wasn't just about Claire's art. In the back corner of the hearth, Ryan had set up a table filled with his own creations, small tarts, hand-rolled pastries, and vibrant dishes he had crafted over the years, inspired by Claire's work. A sign hung above it that read, "Food is art. Art is storytelling." A group of teens stood at the table, eagerly sampling the dishes. Ryan moved among them, sharing the stories behind each creation. "This one," he said, gesturing to a lemon tart with bright yellow filling, "reminds me of the first time I found the courage to try something new. It was inspired by Claire's sketch of a sunset. She told me to trust myself, and I did." The teens nodded, taking notes and asking questions. One boy looked up at Ryan, awe in his eyes. "So, cooking isn't just about following a recipe?" Ryan smiled. "It's about putting yourself into it. Your thoughts, your emotions, everything you are, becomes part of what you create." From across the room, Claire watched Ryan with quiet admiration. He had found his place, not just as a chef, but as a mentor, a storyteller, and a dreamer unafraid to share his light with others. As the day stretched into evening, the energy in the hearth never wavered. Local musicians performed soft acoustic sets, their melodies weaving through the space, like threads of warmth. At the center of it all were Claire and Ryan, surrounded by friends, neighbors, and strangers alike. Even those who had once doubted Claire's presence or questioned Ryan's changes now mingled with smiles on their faces. It was as if the barriers that had divided the town for so long had finally crumbled, replaced by something stronger: connection, understanding, and pride in what they had built together. "Look at them," Ryan said quietly, stepping beside Claire. She turned to follow his gaze. The diner was filled with people, laughing, talking, sharing stories. The walls seemed to glow brighter, as if the art and light inside had spread to everyone who walked through the doors. Claire leaned her head against Ryan's shoulder, a contented smile on her lips. "This isn't just our dream anymore," she said softly. "It belongs to everyone." Ryan nodded, his voice gentle. "And it's only the beginning." A year had passed, and the hearth had grown beyond anyone's wildest expectations. The diner was no longer just a place to eat. It was a sanctuary for creativity, learning, and community. The town square was alive with activity on this particular morning. A new art exhibition was being held, and young artists from Willow Creek and beyond had gathered to display their work. Inside the hearth, Ryan stood in the kitchen, teaching a group of children how to make bread. Flour dusted their hands and cheeks as they laughed and kneaded the dough, their faces full of joy. Claire stood by the window, her sketchbook open as she captured the scene. She paused to watch Ryan, her heart full, as she saw him thriving in the role he was born to play. "You're a natural, you know," she said, approaching him as the kids scattered to wash their hands. Ryan grinned. "What can I say? I had a good teacher." Claire laughed, bumping his shoulder playfully. Together, they stepped outside, where the afternoon sunlight bathed Willow Creek in a golden glow. As the day drew to a close, Claire and Ryan sat on a bench outside the hearth, watching as the town buzzed with life. Claire opened her sketchbook to a blank page, her pencil hovering above it. "What are you drawing?" Ryan asked, his voice soft. Claire looked at him with a smile. "The two of us, right here, right now." She began to sketch, Ryan beside her, the glow of the hearth behind them, and the Willow Creek clock tower in the distance. It wasn't just a drawing, it was a story. One of resilience, hope, and the quiet magic of believing in yourself and each other. When the sketch was finished, Claire held it up. The light of the setting sun caught the page, casting a golden hue over it. Ryan looked at her, his voice full of quiet wonder. "It's perfect." Claire turned to him, her gaze steady. "So are we." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Willow Creek fell into a peaceful stillness. The hearth's lights glowed like a beacon, a reminder of the journey that had brought them here. A journey not of escape, but of returning home to themselves. "Success," Claire whispered, more to herself than to Ryan, "isn't about leaving. It's about spreading your light so others can shine too." Ryan smiled, his hand curling gently around hers. "And you've done just that." The final image lingered. Claire and Ryan sitting side by side, the light of the hearth glowing behind them, and the clock tower standing tall against the twilight sky. It was more than an ending. It was the beginning of a legacy that would live on forever.